You don't just buy a Rolex, you enter into a bond. Rolex operates a tightly policed, closed-loop corporate ecosystem that tracks your identity long after you sign the receipt. Behind the pristine glass of your local authorized dealer sits a private, charitable foundation that answers to no shareholders, publishes zero production reports, and quietly manufactures over 1 million watches a year while manufacturing an illusion of extreme scarcity. Today, we are executing a complete valuation audit of the Rolex empire. We'll dissect their multi-billion-dollar acquisition of Bucherer, the secret off-catalog rooms reserved exclusively for VVIPs, and how their century-long pursuit of absolute control inadvertently created a massive counterfeit shadow economy. 1. The wait list. They will not tell you how many they make. Ask for a Submariner, and it is always sold out. But behind that word sits a company that finessed itself into international headlines, bought its own biggest dealer outright, and owns the single most stolen name on the planet. The waitlist is the tip. Here's what's underneath. There is a second layer to the surface story that gets less attention: the no-flip culture. Plenty of authorized dealers now make regular customers agree, sometimes even in writing, not to resell a hard-to-get watch within a year of buying it. Break that promise, get caught flipping too fast on a site like Chrono24, and the boutique quietly closes the door on you forever. No appeal, no explanation required. But here's what that actually reveals. Rolex and its dealers are not just rationing watches. They are policing what customers are allowed to do with a product after they already own it, which is not how buying something usually works anywhere else in retail. It is not. Sold out is not an accident. It is not a supply chain problem, and it is not a company struggling to keep pace with demand it never expected. What sits underneath that phrase is a business built to look nothing like any other luxury company on earth. One with no shareholders to please, no public earnings call to survive, and no legal requirement to tell a single outsider how many watches actually leave the factory floor each year. And that secrecy, once you start pulling at it, connects to almost everything else in this video. The dealer who lost their business over it, the watches you will never even be offered a chance to buy, the counterfeit that might be sitting in a stranger's display case right now, priced to fool you. Even the reason a watch on your own wrist can turn you into a target on a city street after dark. Somewhere online right now, someone is posting their own version of this story. A screenshot of a boutique receipt, 3 years of purchases listed out, captioned with something like, "Finally got the call." Hundreds of strangers show up in the replies, congratulating a person they have never met, because everyone scrolling past has stood in that exact same waiting room at some point, real or digital. That reaction is not really about the watch either. It is relief. Proof that the system, opaque as it is, occasionally lets someone in. Here's the thing worth sitting with before we go any further. The wait is not a flaw in the system. The wait is the system. Start at the surface. Go down from there. That waitlist story is the one everyone already tells. The next layer down is the one Rolex would rather nobody found. Before we move on to the next part, let me tell you this. Most people don't realize this, but buying a watch the wrong way can cost you thousands, and you won't even notice it until it's too late. That's why I created a complete insider guide to buying watches. The goal is simple. I'll help you stop guessing and start buying smart. You'll find the guide in the pinned comment and description. Now, let's move on to the next part. 2. The numbers they won't show you. Rolex does not publish an annual report. It does not answer to shareholders because it does not have any. Since 1960, the entire company has been owned by something called the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation, a private charitable trust named after the man who built the brand out of a small London import business back in 1905. There is no stock ticker, investor calls, and legal obligation to publish a single number about how many watches actually roll off the production line each year. The foundation is also registered as a Swiss charitable trust, which means Rolex pays a lower tax rate than an ordinary company would. So, the secrecy is not only a marketing choice, it is baked directly into the legal structure that makes the whole company tax efficient in the first place. So how does anyone know anything at all? Industry analysts piece it together sideways through Swiss export data, factory permits, and careful estimates built up over years. The most widely cited figures, published by the watch industry analysts at Lux Consult and Morgan Stanley, put Rolex production at around 1.2 million watches in 2023. It was close to 1.2 million again in 2024, generating an estimated 10.5 billion Swiss francs in revenue, with an implied retail value near 15.5 billion within the same period. 1.2 million watches a year is not a shortage. That is a factory running at a scale most automakers would recognize. Ponder that. A brand built almost entirely on the idea of scarcity is quietly producing more than 1 million watches every single year, roughly one every 27 seconds around the clock. And still, walking into a boutique and asking for the wrong reference gets you the same answer every single time. Nothing available. The factories in Geneva and Bienne have not stopped running. Yet the watches leaving those factories are never actually meant to sit in a display case, waiting for you to notice them. Because, and this is the part that took me a while to actually accept, the secrecy is not a side effect of how big Rolex has become. It is the business model itself. Every publicly traded luxury company answers to investors who want units sold to climb, quarter after quarter, forever. More watches, more revenue, more growth, repeated until the whole thing collapses under its own weight. Rolex answers to a foundation with no obligation to grow, no pressure to flood the market, and every incentive to protect the one thing that makes a Rolex worth wanting in the first place: the fact that not everyone can have one. A company that sold every watch it could physically make would stop being special within a single fiscal year. A company that could make far more and simply chooses not to gets to stay legendary forever. That is not a flaw in the plan. That is the entire plan. Picture the 11-year-old kid flipping through a magazine ad, seeing that crown, and deciding this is what made it looks like. Rolex has spent 100 years engineering exactly that feeling on purpose, in millions of people, all at once, and then making sure the feeling never quite gets satisfied. Compare that to Rolex's own sister company, Tudor, which makes far fewer watches, sells them at a much lower price, and is comparatively easy to walk in and buy. Same owner, same factories in Geneva and Bienne, same watchmaking DNA passed down from Hans Wilsdorf himself. But almost nobody camps outside a Tudor boutique. The difference is not the quality of the product sitting in the case. The difference is which brand Rolex has decided, deliberately, to keep just out of reach. And once you understand that Rolex controls its own mystery deliberately, the boutique on Saturday morning stops looking like a simple case of high demand meeting limited supply. It starts looking like theater, with a script and a set of rules everyone in the room already knows. Quick one for the comments. If you could only own one Rolex, which reference would it be? Answer below, which raises an obvious question. If the company is deliberately withholding, who actually decides who gets let in? The company sets the scarcity from the top. Somebody still has to hand out the actual watches. That job carries more power than you would ever guess. 3. The gatekeepers. Here is where it gets uncomfortable for the people who sell you the watch, not just the people trying to buy one. Authorized dealers do not simply stock Rolex and sell to whoever walks through the door first. They are handed an allocation, a small monthly or yearly quota decided entirely by Rolex, and then left to decide which customers deserve the good stuff. In practice, that usually means buying other things first. A bracelet here, a less desirable model there. Showing up, being pleasant, being patient, building what the industry politely calls a relationship. Everyone in the watch community has a blunter word for this, and it is not a flattering one. Sales associates themselves are stuck in the middle of it, expected to smile through the same rejected request hundreds of times a month, knowing full well which regulars will get the call and which ones never will, unable to say so out loud. There is a reason one longtime French dealer, Pellegrin and Fields, still talks about what happened to them back in 2013. They say Rolex quietly dropped them from the authorized network with no clear explanation, right around the time they pushed to start selling watches online. Rolex denied any connection, but the timing is the kind of detail that does not fade. And it became part of a much larger legal fight that would take another decade to surface publicly. in a French courtroom with real evidence on the table. Because in December 2023, French regulators fined Rolex 91 million euros, not for the price of the watches, for controlling where customers were even allowed to buy them. For over 10 years, Rolex had banned every one of its authorized dealers from selling watches online at all, forcing each purchase to happen inside a physical store, face-to-face, entirely on Rolex's terms. Investigators found no solid evidence that Rolex was fixing the actual prices dealers charged. What they found instead was quieter, and in some ways, far more effective. A company that had built a wall around price comparison itself. If you cannot shop around from your couch, you cannot easily tell whether the store 15 minutes away is treating you fairly. You just trust the walls of whichever boutique you happen to be standing inside. That is not really a fine about money. It is a fine about information. 2 years later, Rolex was still fighting in court over the same case, this time trying to keep large portions of its own submitted evidence, detailed economic studies covering production, sales figures, and product availability, sealed away from public view as part of its own appeal. A company can spend a decade in litigation over online sales and still, at the very end of it, be more focused on hiding the paperwork than on changing the policy that caused the fine in the first place. And in 2025, Rolex went further still, filing suit against an online retailer called Wrist Aficionado, accusing it of posing as an authorized seller and marketing watches on platforms like YouTube in ways that Rolex says mislead customers about where the watches actually came from. Guard the front door. Guard the resale market. Now, guard the internet too. Then, in August 2023, Rolex made its boldest move yet. It announced it would acquire Bucherer outright, its largest and longest-running retail partner, a family business that had sold Rolex watches since 1924. Before that deal, Rolex owned exactly one store on Earth, a single boutique in Geneva. Everything else, every gleaming display case in every city, belonged to independent dealers who answered to Rolex but were not actually part of the company. Bucherer changed that overnight. More than 100 sales outlets across 7 countries, roughly half of them already selling Rolex, folded into the parent company in a deal analysts estimated at somewhere between 3 and 4 billion Swiss francs. The exact price, naturally, was never disclosed. Rolex's chief executive, Jean-Frédéric Dufour, told an audience at Dubai Watch Week that the company had no intention of growing Bucherer and that Bucherer remained a small part of the overall business. Maybe that turns out to be true, but the acquisition still handed Rolex something no allocation quota or antitrust fine ever could: direct access to Bucherer's own client files, the purchase histories of the retailer's most valuable customers, the exact data that decides who gets offered what. For the first time in its history, the company that makes the watch and the company that quietly decides who deserves to buy it became, at least in part, the very same company. The control does not stop once the watch is actually on your wrist, either. Rolex restricts genuine replacement parts to its own official service centers and refuses to sell components to independent watchmakers, no matter how skilled or well-established they are. Take your watch to the wrong repair shop, even one run by someone with decades of experience, and they cannot legally get the actual Rolex part your movement needs. They have to improvise, or turn the customer away, or quietly source something close enough and hope nobody checks too carefully later. So the sale is controlled. The resale is controlled through the Bucherer-run Certified Pre-Owned program. And now the repair is controlled too, funneled back through the same official network, whether you bought your watch new, secondhand, or inherited it from someone else entirely. Buy a Rolex, and you do not just own a watch. You enter a closed loop that follows the watch for the rest of its life, and yours. So the front door is guarded, the resale market is owned, and even the repair shop answers to headquarters. But the deepest layer of this iceberg is not the front door at all. It is a room most customers never learn exists. 4. The room you'll never see. Somewhere above the regular allocation system sits a tier that Rolex does not advertise, publish, or even fully acknowledge in public. Every year, alongside the watches shown on Rolex.com, The brand produces a small, rotating set of what it privately calls exceptional pieces, gem set, high jewelry, sometimes built around materials like meteorite that never touch a standard catalog page. A handful get revealed publicly each spring at the big Geneva trade show, Watches and Wonders. In 2026, for the 100th anniversary of the Oyster case, Rolex publicly showed only 2 of these ultra-exclusive pieces to press and collectors. Industry writers who cover the brand closely reported that rumors of additional, unshown references were already circulating, allegedly based on early emails sent quietly to dealers and a small list of VIP clients months before the public event even opened its doors. Most exceptional watches do not. According to reporting from inside the industry, that public handful is only the surface of a far larger off-catalog menu, quietly offered to a small circle of VIP clients through their top-tier boutiques. You will not find a price list. You will not find a web page. The only way in is a purchase history deep enough and a relationship close enough that a boutique manager decides on their own to make a phone call on your behalf. Some of these off-catalog pieces use materials Rolex sources in unusually small quantities. Slices of actual meteorite for dials, rare colored gemstones set by hand, one at a time, by specialists who spend weeks on a single case. There is only so much meteorite in the supply chain at any given moment, which means even if Rolex wanted to make more of these particular watches, in a normal year, it simply could not. Scarcity here is not always manufactured. Sometimes it is real, geological, unavoidable. But Rolex has built an entire access system around that tiny sliver of genuine scarcity and quietly let it bleed into how it manages watches that are not actually rare at all. The steel sports models made by the hundreds of thousands every year. One kind of scarcity borrows credibility from the other. Think about what that actually means. The dealer relationship everyone jokes about online. The years of buying bracelets and straps and less desirable models just to prove you are serious is not really about customer service at all. It functions closer to a credit history. Every past purchase becomes a small piece of evidence that you belong, evidence that you will not flip the watch the moment it leaves the store, evidence that you are the kind of customer worth spending Rolex's rarest inventory on. The boutique is not simply watching what you buy, it is quietly building a file on who you are, purchase by purchase, year after year. I will be honest. This is the layer that unsettles me the most, more than the crime statistics coming later in this video. Because it means the entire earn it culture surrounding Rolex, the thing fans treat as a kind of harmless game, is really a sorting mechanism running in the background of every single transaction. And sorting mechanisms, by definition, always have a bottom. Somebody is always the customer who never quite gets the call. Somewhere, right now, a longtime customer is walking out of a boutique holding a small green box they were not expecting. Something quietly pulled from the back after years of buying watches nobody else particularly wanted. And somewhere else, at the exact same moment, another customer with just as much money and just as much patience is walking out with nothing, again for the 4th year running, having no idea a room like that even exists to be excluded from. The realest watches are the hardest to reach on Earth. Somewhere below them sits a market flooded with watches that are not real at all. 5. The fake market. Rolex's secrecy protects the brand. It also, unintentionally, protects an entire industry built on faking it. A widely cited 2023 study from the pre-owned platform Watchfinder estimated that roughly half of all watches sold on the open secondary market under the Rolex name may actually be counterfeit. Half. Not a niche problem confined to sketchy street vendors in tourist cities, but a shadow economy operating in plain sight, online, at flea markets, occasionally even inside stores that look legitimate enough to fool a careful first-time buyer holding what feels like a real box and a real card. Rolex has never had to say this part out loud, but the pattern makes the logic obvious on its own. You cannot spend a century building the single most recognizable symbol in an entire industry and then act surprised when millions of people who cannot afford the real one decide to buy a convincing imitation instead. The demand does not disappear just because the supply is restricted. It just goes looking for a cheaper door. Rolex's answer was the Certified Pre-Owned program, launched in partnership with Bucherer before the acquisition, letting authorized dealers sell used Rolex watches online with the brand's own authentication stamped on the sale. It is worth noticing what that program quietly admits. For decades, Rolex justified banning online sales by pointing to counterfeiting and gray market risk. Then it built the exact online authentication tool it had always claimed was impossible. The moment doing so let Rolex, not independent dealers, control the resale market too. Here is the connection nobody puts in one sentence. The same secrecy that makes a real Rolex feel priceless is the reason nobody outside the company can say with total confidence what real production even looks like. When the actual manufacturer will not tell you the numbers, counterfeiters do not need to beat quality control. They only need to beat uncertainty. And uncertainty, it turns out, is remarkably easy to fake with a convincing enough box. Picture the buyer who finds what looks like a steal on a classifieds app. A Datejust, private seller, cash only, priced just low enough to feel lucky rather than suspicious. The weight feels close enough. The second-hand sweeps instead of ticks, which used to be the tell everyone relied on, until fakes got good enough to sweep too. The only real proof sits inside the case back, on a movement most private buyers will never open and could not read even if they did. So, the sale happens on trust, in a parking lot, between two strangers, and only one of them actually knows what is inside that case. Because here's the part that should bother you more than it probably does. The exact same scarcity that makes owning a real one feel like a personal achievement is what makes so many people willing to skip the boring, careful steps. An authorized dealer, a documented service history, a real authentication check, just to avoid missing their shot. Scarcity does not just create demand, it creates shortcuts, and shortcuts are exactly where counterfeiters make their living. A real Rolex movement is finished, to a standard most owners will never see and could not judge, even if they open the case, which is exactly the gap a good enough fake is built to exploit. Which watch would you check twice before buying secondhand? Type it below. A fake Rolex can only steal your money. What sits at the very bottom of this iceberg has, in the worst cases, cost people their lives. 6. The price of being seen. This is not new. Back in the 1980s, police across American cities, from Los Angeles to Houston to Washington, tracked a wave of so-called Rolex robbers. Women who drugged businessmen in hotel bars and vanished with their watches before the men ever woke up. Some victims survived with nothing worse than a headache and an empty wrist. Others did not survive at all. One Los Angeles detective at the time put it bluntly to a local paper. It was never really about the watch itself. It was about the money the watch so obviously represented. Decades later, the pattern resurfaced in London wearing a different disguise. A gang of young women posing as charity workers, approaching wealthy older men with a clipboard and a friendly question, distracting them just long enough to slip a Rolex off an unguarded wrist. The method changes. The target does not. By 2022, London police had a name for the modern version: the Rolex Ripper crime wave. Watch thefts in England and Wales nearly doubled between 2015 and 2022. Climbing past 11,000 reported thefts a year, with London absorbing most of it. In human terms, that is close to 30 watches stolen somewhere in the country every single day, year after year, for the better part of a decade. Men on mopeds, riding up behind pedestrians, grabbing a wrist, and disappearing into traffic before anyone could react. In one stretch of early 2022, thieves struck over 100 times in just 2 months across central London alone. The tactics keep shifting to stay ahead of the headlines. In New York's West Village, a man named Eric Goldie had a gun pointed at his side by a robber who already knew exactly which watch he was wearing before he ever saw the man's face, tipped off by someone who had clocked it earlier that night. The same evening, A few blocks away, another man accepted a ride from two women he had just met, in a car that looked expensive enough to feel safe. He woke up later with no memory of the ride and no watch on his wrist. Different city, different decade, same basic playbook. The Rolex robbers were running back in the 1980s. Get close, get trusted, get gone before anyone notices what is missing. Rolex is not an incidental part of this story. It is the headline. The Watch Register, a private London database tracking stolen luxury watches worldwide, reports that Rolex accounts for roughly 44% of every stolen watch checked against its system, a database covering hundreds of other brands. In July 2025, a 24-year-old father named Blue Stevens was stabbed to death outside a casino in Knightsbridge during a robbery for his gold Rolex. He is one name attached to a pattern stretching back decades. Once a watch like that disappears, getting it back is close to hopeless. Investigators at the Watch Register say a stolen watch is usually resold within minutes or hours, often to a buyer who never asks where it came from, and recovery rates across reported cases sit somewhere around 1%. So the theft itself is rarely the end of the story for the victim. It is the start of a much longer one, filed away, unlikely to close, one entry in a growing database that keeps growing precisely because the watch keeps being worth stealing. So why this brand specifically? Why not the equally expensive Patek Philippe or the even pricier Richard Mille worn by rappers and athletes in every music video released this year? Part of the answer is instant recognition. You do not need to be a watch person to clock a Rolex crown from 30 feet away, which makes it the easiest luxury symbol on earth to identify at a glance. From a moving moped, in a dark street, in under 2 seconds. The same instant recognition marketing that took a century to build. The same crown that makes a stranger across a room register your success without a word exchanged. Works exactly as well for a criminal sizing up a target. Rolex spent 100 years building the most effective visual shorthand in the luxury industry. It just never got to choose who would be reading it. Every layer down has been darker than the one before it. The bottom of this iceberg is not a secret room or a crime wave. It is the reason all of it exists in the first place. Why it all exists. Go back to that boutique on Saturday morning, the man asking about the steel Daytona, the practiced smile, the nothing available. None of what came after that moment happens by accident. Not the foundation that answers to nobody. Not the €91 million fine for keeping customers in the dark. Not the acquisition of its own biggest dealer. Not the off-catalog watches reserved for people with the right purchase history. Not the counterfeit market thriving in the fog Rolex itself created. Not even the crime wave built on a logo that everyone, criminals included, can spot in an instant. 7 layers down, and every single one connects back to the same word: control. A company that wanted to eliminate every one of those problems could. Rolex could publish real numbers. It could open its allocation system to actual transparency. It could flood the market until steel Daytonas sat on shelves like any other product, until the resale premium collapsed, until the theft targets moved on to something else entirely. It has chosen not to for 100 years, because scarcity was never a byproduct of Rolex's success. Scarcity is the product. Everything you just watched, the fines, the secret rooms, the fakes, the robberies, is water pressure. It is what happens when a company squeezes supply this hard for this long on something this many people want. Because think about what actually made every single layer of this possible. Not a factory, not a marketing department. 100 years of one decision, repeated quarter after quarter, generation after generation. Make less than you could, and let the wanting do the rest of the work for free. Every fine, every lawsuit, every off-catalog watch, every counterfeit, every robbery on a dark street. All of it traces back to that one choice, made once by a foundation with nobody left to answer to. The watch was never really the point. The wanting was, which layer of this got you the most? Drop it in the comments, like, and subscribe.